Welcome to Frisky, a podcast on everything marketing and sexuality. Hello, Athanasia.
Hi, Daniela. Thank you, everyone, for listening and tuning in to another episode. Today, we have with us Rodney Collins, co-director of intelligence at Outvertising, and we're going to talk about representation and the advertising industry in the UK. Welcome, Rodney.
Welcome.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be on Frisky and speaking to you this morning.
Can you tell us a little bit about your work and about advertising and all the important projects that you're working on at the moment?
Okay, of course. Yeah, a pleasure. So I'm speaking to you today from a position as co-director of intelligence at Outvertising. Outvertising, I'll just articulate that well. Outvertising rather than advertising. It's easy to confuse them when you hear them. But Outvertising is an organization, a charity, a volunteer-led organization that drives inclusivity in the marketing and advertising industry in the UK. We're focused on LGBTQIA plus representation, and we look at two sides of the coin. One is the work that we create, the comms, the creative communications that advertisers and marketers put out into the world, and then the workplaces where our people work, and looking at driving inclusivity in both of those sort of arenas of activity within the industry. So I've been a co-director of intelligence at Outvertising for just over 2 years. I joined the volunteer-led and run board of directors at a time when the ambition was to develop and publish what we were calling an index, sort of census of the LGBTQIA plus presence, perspective, expectation of the industry, of marketing, of advertising, of brands. And so that project, that initiative, when I joined, was at a point of partnership with YouGov. YouGov had come into a conversation and had agreed to be a co-sponsor, or in some senses a co-creator of that piece of work, of that piece of research and analysis. So we were able to access YouGov's profiles data, which is a really exciting data set. If anybody has had the pleasure, the privilege to move through that data set, it's constantly updated. It's, as you might know, it's a very rich data set. It's flexible. There are omnibus questions that are regularly asked of the panel around sort of advertising and brands, but there are also really interesting cultural factor questions, which for me as an anthropologist, that's my training, my professional background, is really fascinating because very timely and current questions are asked. So, things that are happening, for instance, right now, we're looking at that data set and it's providing us with some perspective on some of the conversations in sport around gender, and reflecting on those from a cultural perspective. But for the purpose of that original project, we were looking specifically at how are brands doing when it comes to connecting with, communicating with, and representing the LGBTQIA plus experience in the UK. And there was a rich amount of data in that profiles data. We also conducted some qualitative research, which of course is essential when you're looking at this community for a number of reasons. And I'm happy to talk about some of those challenges when it comes to research and data when you are attempting to reflect and represent the genuine experiences of this community. So there were some challenges in that, but so the qualitative research was intended to help us fill that gap in terms of where the data trail sort of went cold. Anyone familiar with doing research on marginal communities will recognize this challenge, which is that marginalized or historically underrepresented or vulnerable communities tend not to show up in data sets because of a number of reasons. They don't show up in the data set because the screener questions that are developed to bring people onto a panel or a survey are limited and don't provide optionality for indicating one's sort of the dimensions of oneself. And two, if you're a vulnerable person, would you really disclose this to sort of anonymous survey vendor who so like the likelihood of being represented accurately or fully in that kind of data set is limited. So YouGov, of course, is working on that constantly, trying to enrich and sort of really capture representative audience in the UK. But there is that limitation when you get to some of the the LGB are pretty easily represented, more easily represented, but then you get to the Q, the T, the I, the A, the plus, and those parts of our community tend to, one, the questions aren't designed to capture those distinctions, and two, we don't, because they're not captured to design that, we can't really say anything about them. And so, but that's true of any sort of census data. So not just when you're looking at brands and marketing from the perspective of YouGov, governments have that problem too. So in any case, we built this piece of research on the back of those two methodologies, some qualitative work with the community that was focus group oriented, and then the quantitative work. And then we published it, and we're able to tell a story about the sort of place of individuals in marketing in the UK from the LGBT perspective, and Q, because we have questioning. People had, so it's possible to capture that in the data set. So we're able to provide a sort of mirror on the industry in a sense. And that was the first initiative, and that was published about 2 years ago. So that's how I got started in advertising. And we're working on some new stuff now, but I wonder if I should pause and let you ask more questions before I...
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's brilliant to have you here and kind of giving us the perspective of the industry, right? And I really enjoy, I would recommend everyone to kind of have a look at the advertising website, because you guys are a powerhouse, really. And I love that it's volunteer based, and clearly it's not just about hard work, but really putting in the expertise of people working in marketing and advertising, just to kind of provide, this advocacy, because that's what you guys do, isn't it? For the LGBT plus representation, and not only. Something that I wanted to focus is you mentioned the side of brands, and my question for you is, how are things changing? How are brands representing the the different identities that you kind of touched on? And if how are things? How are we doing?
How are we doing? It's a great question. I think if you would have asked me this question 9 months ago, I would have had a very different answer for you. But today, my answer is optimistic, but very realistic about the state of the industry. So first of all, I don't think we're doing very well. We were doing pretty decently at the time of that census that I was referring to. If you look at the data set there, you can see that there are sectors that were sort of really, connecting with people in the community. There was a sense that, especially like gaming brands and brands in tech seem to have a really high resonance and relevance and meaningfulness to people in our community. Some of the sort of more traditional industry sectors like automotive and sports were less likely to have a resonance, a relevance, a meaningfulness, inclusivity. So you had the spectrum, but at least it seems that within every sector there was movement, and there was some brands that had like a halo or an aura of like benevolence to and inclusivity to our community. Today that's shifting, and we're watching this. We've started a new project that is very exciting, actually. It's we're referring to it with the working title of the Advertising Ad Index, and this index is being co-created by a coalition of organizations within the industry. So we're bringing together various platforms or channel leaders and looking at some of the work that they've already done in exploring and investigating the extent of representation in their channels, and aligning on the approach to evaluating and auditing that representation, and then looking at the impact, the sort of performance and effectiveness of that marketing. So that's very exciting because, as you know, people consume media or advertising or marketing in a really interesting way, right? Because they're sort of like, we live in these cross-channel lives, right? Our lives sort of move, you're sort of moving through a city, you see a billboard, and then you see a poster in the underground, and then you're on your phone and you're getting some digital display, and then you're getting an email. So like you're receiving a lot of communications, and that mix is really important to capture rather than looking at any single channel. And it tends to be the case that a lot of analysis currently available looks at a single channel, might look at linear TV, or might look at radio, or might look at digital, right? Look at social or something, but doesn't tend to have a holistic approach to how we're actually taking it in. So that's our hypothesis, is that it might be actually pretty good if you look at all cross-channel, if you sort of look at the spread of media that our communications that an individual is exposed to. But if you're looking at any one of those channels, it doesn't look great. There are some champions within the industry, within marketing, that tend to regularly support and create communications that matter. And we could talk a little bit about those, but I think the important point to note is that in the current geopolitical context, there has been, to our sort of anecdotal understanding, less representation this year than in previous years. And I'll just tell you how that's coming across to us. It's not sort of like, this is not, rigorous. It's a focus group of board of directors at Outvertising who are paying attention and taking note and are involved in judging on awards across the industry. And, so we're there to provide that voice and provide that perspective on sort of an inclusive approach to marketing. But we're just sharing a lot less with one another in terms of great work, of great communications. Because really, that's what we're looking at, this hallmark, these hero products of the industry, which is, these wonderful ads that move you, or this new space in which you're represented, or some bold campaign that has a really strong message that is really relevant and perhaps universal. And I have a few examples of stuff that we've loved in the past, but it just seems like there's less investments, there's less movement, and so that's one of the reasons why this ad index is so important, that's looking at this cross-channel experience, because perhaps it's just showing up in different ways. Perhaps the representation and the inclusivity and the stories that are captured are just coming across to people in unique and sort of novel and maybe very smart and crafty ways.
It would be really interesting if you can share with us some of these good practices and interesting examples from brands. I was reading on your website also some of the reports that you put out there, and what struck me was that reports that you produce for companies had the business case of why they should have inclusive representations and the ethical case of why they should. Can you tell us also a little bit more about that, of having to come up with both the ethical reasons and the business reasons to convince these organizations to engage more in inclusive representations?
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good observation. We do have those. We do approach our partners and people in the industry with both of those rationale. Like, this is both a good for business and good for people. And because it's good for people, it's good for business, and because it's good for business, it's good for people. Like this is like a symbiotic, synergistic relationship. So the there's any number of organizations within the industry have looked at like the effectiveness and impact of inclusive marketing, and everything that anybody has ever published in this regard shows that inclusive marketing and communications, or even like just diversity, or more just having more diverse experiences in that marketing, in those communications, tends to resonate better with audiences. And so, one of our partners spends a lot of time, System One, that you might be familiar with them. They spend a lot of time looking at how people respond to advertising, particularly TVCs and creative campaigns. And what their research shows is that by and large, the communications and marketing that is more inclusive tends to perform better in terms of like the sentiment and response to that marketing. And then we also know from the effectiveness perspective that inclusive marketing tends to be more effective. And so our partners at Ipsos and at the Effies in the UK have both published research to demonstrate this. So both this is really the commercial impact of inclusivity. And then we just know that people out in the world, I think we all have that experience of seeing a piece of content that is our story, that is like reflects some aspect of our own experience, that it just resonates, it's more memorable, it's less likely to be forgotten, then, so that sort of contributes to the equity of the brand and sort of the aura of the brand. So we know that with people, when stories are real and authentic and genuine, and they reflect real experience, that they tend to be remembered. And that memory is something that people will advocate for, right? Because it is meaningful to them. So one of the campaigns that I think, this is historic, right? So this is a few years ago, but a partner of ours, the National Lottery published, had a campaign called Pockets. I don't know if you're familiar with this campaign. It's a few years ago, but the campaign is great. What you will see is in the campaign, what you'll see is this couple. You'll see the story, but you'll follow a story over time, and you'll follow the story of these two men who sort of age through the ad. And what you see as they age is that one of these men has his numbers on the slip of paper, right? So he has he's kept it in his pocket. So that's why it's called Pockets, right? So he keeps carrying around these lucky numbers in the hope that someday he'll win the lottery. And as you're watching this hope, right, this hope of like, oh my gosh, my numbers, are they going to ever call my number? You see this relationship mature, and these two people move through life together. As really like the product is featured really nicely in the ad, so it's clearly a National Lottery campaign, but you see this really kind of wonderful story that's perhaps not. In many ways, it's a universal story, right? A couple, like, young relationships growing mature, and it's just a really universal story, and it was really effective, very impactful. You can look at it. There's lots of reporting on the performance of that campaign. But what was powerful about that campaign was that from the very beginning, they involved partners. The research partner, an agency, then leadership within the client organization, that all were both sort of allies and members of the community. So there was always like a real conversation with the authenticity, the genuine nature of the story, and it just resonates. And so there's some interesting things that happened during that campaign's development. But I think for the purpose of our conversation, it just was a really excellent case of performance, effects, meaningfulness being good for the business, also being good for culture. And so, that's. I mean, I think that's a really a hallmark case. There are other cases that are, that really interesting. So, like product development, innovation.
Great, thank you. I'm really loving these examples from campaigns. I think I need to catch up, and I honestly feel it's refreshing to hear about the engagement that these, brands and services do with communities in preparing and checking out. I guess we don't know most of the times as consumers, like all the work that is going on behind the scenes. So thank you for sharing. I also crave a bit of a feel-good moment, and you mentioned some champions. So I guess brands that really work consistently with, promoting inclusivity and diversity. Of course, if you can name names and give examples, that would be great. But also, does it pay off, and in which way?
Yeah, I mean, so I guess the examples that I've given so far are both E45 and National Lottery, which you'll find in those case studies. If you were to, just do a quick search, you'll find public data, publicly available data around the effectiveness and the impact of those campaigns. So you'll be able to see what the metrics were that were used to measure the success of those two campaigns. I think the other, I mean, I suppose there are all sorts of metrics to, I was judging the data and marketing awards last year, and I was in conversation with some of the organizers, and it turns out that that when looking at the success of a campaign, they have hundreds of metrics that individuals use to measure their effectiveness or their success. So there are so many variables by which advertisers and marketers are looking at the quality of the work that they create. And it really varies based upon strategic objectives of the organization. So, some are looking for reach, engagement, share of voice, share of wallet. There's so many different variables that are used. I mean, obviously, these are commercial entities, and for the most part, are looking for commercial impact. But that commercial impact is also tied to other dynamics within the market. And so all those market variables are used by these advertisers and these marketers to assess the quality of the work. And I don't know if you've ever spent any time looking at the Effie's process, you'll see that kind of rigor in isolating the factors or the variables that showcase the effectiveness of that work. So
can I interrupt you, sorry, for a second? If you could explain to our audience what the Effies are.
All right, sure. The Effies is an organization, global organization. They have chapters in countries around the world. And the organization is set up to both encourage as well as award and recognize the most effective marketing in globally and then within a country. So the Effies UK looks at creative work in the UK, and this work is submitted to the Effies with a rationale for both the sort of strategic development of the work, its sort of creative execution, and then also its impact and performance. So you'll be able to understand from insight to impact what a piece of creative communications has achieved. And so agencies in partnership with their clients, so any creative agency or sometimes an in-house agency, will look at the Effies as a real indicator of its excellence, of creative excellence, or so marketing excellence, really. And it's assessed through its effectiveness at achieving its defined strategic objectives. as a piece of work. So if your objectives, as you declare what those objectives are, right? As a marketer, you're like, oh, I actually just, I want to raise the profile of my product in a market, and you define those. So it's everything from sales to engagement to reach to yeah. So but as I said, there are like so many metrics by which somebody will look at these changing sentiment, right? So changing attitudes or beliefs about a brand is one kind of metric. So it's kind of esoteric or sort of a little bit slippery, but there are ways to do that, of course, right? So you sort of say like positive sentiment towards our brand, and you can measure that, of course, if that's what you're wanting to shift as a marketer, right? So but yeah, so that it's a really important organization within the advertising and marketing industry, and it is increasingly how you demonstrate to organizations or clients or commercial operatives that their investment in creativity is valuable and meaningful.
How are you able to measure impact within advertising with the work that you're doing?
Yeah, this is a great question. So we look at a number of things. So we have this is actually great timing. I don't know when this is going to be aired, but we have an annual conference in November. So this year it's November 19th, and it's in London. So that is a sort of capstone event of the year where we host sort of the industry's only dedicated LGBTQIA plus inclusive conference, and we do that annually. So participation and attendance, that is a great way to showcase our impact. We look at our sort of profile in the media. So we also look at how we get out there and advocate in the trade press and beyond. We also look at our engagement with organizations like our client partners and our agency partners, and there are all sorts of sort of trainings that we've developed. We have a playbook to help guide inclusivity in the industry, and one of the things, as I mentioned earlier, we're building is this ad index, which we hope could at some point provide sort of I guess you'd say a full loop through the industry from sort of insight or data around the community to the point of creative execution to the point of impact and performance. So that's in the product. So those are the two spaces. You're like, oh, how much are we, like, we have a mentorship program, so participation in the mentorship program. So all of these different programs that we facilitate are the ways in which we look at the success. But ultimately, the mission is to drive inclusivity in the industry, both with the product that we make and the people that work in the industry. So they're both, so the ad index is really going to help us with the work, and then we have this playbook and these partnerships that are driving it within the industry. So participation in those programs are really important for us to know of our impact. Yeah, but I think those are this is a great question, and it's obviously we have it's I guess the challenge for us is that we're not in control of the final product of any of this. We're an advocacy organization, and so keeping the conversation moving, providing resources, having people use our materials, our tools, the census that I talked about, the OCR, the Advertising Consumer Report, the playbook, taking up our trainings, becoming involved with us as volunteers, becoming involved as a mentee or mentor. Those are all ways in which we sort of know that our impact is important and meaningful.
Brilliant. A quick one to wrap this up. Is there any new trend or any emergent configuration of communication advertising in this space that we should be aware of, that you see emerging now?
When you say trend, what are you thinking about in particular?
I wonder if there's like any for example, ways of representing or identities that are becoming represented that maybe they were not, or new sensibility as well in relation to LGBT plus in advertising?
One of the things we've been talking about recently is that, okay, so there's a couple of things that happen in advertising. One is, how do you know that the ad that you're watching is LGBTQIA plus inclusive, right? What are the indicators? Is it because you know that that actor is a member of the community, or is it that the story is very explicitly about this kind of experience? So there are these sort of contextual cues and then these sort of visible cues or indicators. We've been talking a little bit about how there's an aesthetic that is, sort of originates within the community that has been sort of, I won't use the word appropriated, but utilized or deployed in communication. So I'm thinking about sort of like a very camp aesthetic. If you think about sort of RuPaul, and you think about like this very camp sort of drag experience, and how that aesthetic plays into like content from other creators. So I mean, there's plenty of examples like in pop music where pop musicians sort of borrow that aesthetic always, right? Like, so you think about Chapel Roan, right? So she very, very famously talks about how she borrows from the drag community and the queer community to like, create her persona. But that aesthetic is also in advertising, right? So you can see some campaigns. There's like you might have seen this Christina Aguilera Just Eat campaign. It's like our Katy Perry, right? This is very queer, right? It's very camp. And so you're like, actually, is that, so this is an interesting space to sort of recognize. So maybe that's a trend. Maybe this sort of borrowing of an aesthetic without being a queer story necessarily, or about queer, or without necessarily having members of the community involved in as the face of the campaign. So maybe that's something that is important to note. Also, I think the other thing is that there's so much other kinds of content outside of marketing and advertising that tells really fantastic stories. So there's, I think, also awareness that like, oh, we're actually, feature-length films, right? I think they're like, at any one time, Netflix is like, top 10, there's always got to be some kind of content there that's like relevant to the audience of this community.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rodney, for being with us today. And yeah, definitely to anyone listening, please do check out Outvertising website and all the great research they're publishing. Thank you.
Thank you, Rodney, and thank you everyone for listening. Please make sure you follow us and like this episode and tune in next week.
Yeah, bye.
Bye.
Thanks for having me. Bye.